May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The air hung thick with salt and diesel fuel. Beyond the blackened wreckage of Battleship Row, the Pacific stretched westward like a great shroud of blue uncertainty. In the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, beneath the palms and the bright Hawaiian sun, a different kind of war was being fought. Silent, cerebral, fought not with steel, but with paper, patience, and the slow accumulation of impossible detail. Commander Joseph Rochefort sat hunched over a wooden desk stacked with intercept sheets, his khaki uniform rumpled, his eyes red from sleeplessness. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. Overhead, the ventilation system rattled like the breathing of something old and tired. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic clatter of typewriters and the soft shuffle of paper being passed from one codebreaker to another. It was here, in this dim and windowless chamber, that the fate of an empire would be decided, not by admirals or aviators, but by men who understood that war was a language, and language could be broken. 6 months earlier, the Japanese had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single morning. The attack had been a triumph of planning, secrecy, and speed, a demonstration that Japan could strike anywhere, at any time, without warning. But the blow had not been fatal. America remained standing, bloodied but unbowed, and in the months that followed, the war had become a conquest not merely of battleships and bombers, but of information itself. Whoever could read the enemy's intentions first would hold the advantage. And nowhere was this more true than in the vast expanse of the Pacific, where fleets could vanish for weeks into the anti-glue, only to reappear with lethal suddenness. The Imperial Japanese Navy communicated through an encrypted system known as JN-25, a code so complex that even its own operators required codebooks and cipher cables to decipher messages. To the Americans, it was a labyrinth of 5-digit groups, each one representing a word, a number, a ship name, or a geographic coordinate. Breaking it required not genius alone, but obsession, a willingness to catalog every fragment, every recurring pattern, every tiny inconsistency, and to trust that meaning would eventually emerge from the noise. Joseph Rochefort was not a typical naval officer. He had enlisted in 1918 as a teenager, studied Japanese language and culture in Tokyo during the 1920s, and spent years immersed in the arcane world of signals intelligence. By 1942, he commanded the Combat Intelligence Unit, known informally as Station Hypo, a team of mathematicians, linguists, and radio operators tasked with intercepting and deciphering Japanese naval communications. Rochefort lived in the basement. He slept there, ate there, worked 20-hour days without pause. He wore a red smoking jacket over his uniform, not out of eccentricity, but because the air conditioning was broken and the underground room was perpetually cold. His colleagues described him as relentless, methodical, and quietly brilliant. He did not speak unless he had something certain to say, and he had developed a habit that others found maddening. He logged everything. Every intersected message, every partial decrypt, every frequency shift, every call sign jade, every repeated phrase, he recorded it all in meticulous handwritten notes, cross-referenced by date, time, and source. To an outsider, it looked like madness. To Rochefort, it was the only way to see the pattern. By late May 1942, American intelligence had become convinced that Japan was planning a major offensive operation. Intercepted traffic had surged in volume, new call signs had appeared, fleet movement suggested a massive concentration of forces. But where? The Japanese referred to the target only by a two-letter code, AF. Washington believed it might be the Aleutian Islands, or perhaps Midway Atoll, or even the West Coast itself. There was no consensus. Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed certainty. He could not afford to guess. If he positioned his carriers in the wrong place, the war could be lost. And so the task fell to Rochefort and his team as they set to decode the enemy's intentions before it was too late.
The challenge was staggering. JN-25 was not a single code, but a layered encryption system. Each message began with a series of 5-digit groups drawn from a codebook containing thousands of entries. Then, to further obscure meaning, each group was enciphered using an additive table, a second layer of numbers that changed periodically. Even if you broke the additive, you still had to identify what each code group represented. A single intercept might contain 30 or 40 groups, only a handful of which could be read. The rest remained opaque. Progress was measured not in breakthroughs, but in percentages. 10% recovery, then 15, then 20. It was a war of attrition waged against randomness itself. But Rochefort had noticed something. Over weeks of intercepts, certain groups appeared again and again in messages related to geographic locations. One group, a 5-digit sequence, showed up repeatedly whenever traffic mentioned Hawaii. Another appeared in messages about Japanese-held bases. And then there was AF. The group appeared in multiple intercepts during the last week of May, always in context, suggesting a target, a destination, an objective. Rochefort suspected it referred to Midway Atoll, a remote speck of coral 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii, home to a small American garrison and a vital airstrip. But suspicion was not proof. Admiral Ernest Ping, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, demanded certainty. Nimitz could not commit his carriers on intuition alone.
And so, Rochefort devised a plan that was equal parts ingenuity and audacity. On May 19th, he instructed Midway's garrison to send an uncoded radio message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down, and they were running short of drinking water. It was a ruse, a deliberate leak. The message was transmitted in the clear, over open channels where Japanese listening posts would intercept it. Then, Station Hypo waited. 2 days later, on May 21st, a Japanese naval intercept was decoded. It reported that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked. AF was Midway. The target was confirmed. But confirming the target was only the beginning. Rochefort's team now faced an even desperate race. They had to determine when the attack would occur, how many ships Japan would commit, and what their plan of attack would be. The clock was ticking. American carriers needed time to maneuver into position. Fuel had to be arranged, aircraft loaded, pilots briefed. Every hour mattered. And so, in the final days of May 1942, the codebreakers of Station Hypo descended into a frenzy of work that bordered on delirium. They stopped sleeping. They stopped eating regular meals. They subsisted on coffee, cigarettes, and sandwiches brought down from the mess hall. The room became a hive of whispered conversations, scribbled calculations, and the constant rustle of paper. Rochefort moved between desks like a conductor leading an orchestra, checking translations, correlating intercepts, piecing together fragments into a coherent picture. The Japanese had imagined their communications secure. They believed JN-25 was unbreakable, that their plans would remain hidden until the moment their bombers appeared over Midway's lagoon. They operated with the confidence of an empire that had never known defeat in the Pacific, that had conquered Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. To them, America was a nation of soft industrialists and isolationist farmers, capable of building ships but incapable of fighting a determined foe. They believed in the superiority of Japanese training, discipline, and morale. They believed that one more decisive blow would force Washington to negotiate a peace favorable to Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, staked everything on this assumption. He gathered 4 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers and transports, the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled. He planned to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them in a single, overwhelming engagement. It was to be the decisive battle of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan would secure its empire forever. But Yamamoto did not know that his enemy was already reading his mail. The origins of American code-breaking in the Pacific stretch back decades before Pearl Harbor, to a time when the notion of signals intelligence was barely understood. In the years following World War I, a small group of naval officers and civilian mathematicians began experimenting with techniques for intercepting and analyzing foreign communications. They were pioneers working in darkness, with no established doctrine, no training manuals, no institutional support. What they had was curiosity, mathematical aptitude, and the understanding that radio transmissions, once sent, could be captured by anyone with the right equipment. In 1924, the Navy established the Code and Signal Section, a tiny office tasked with studying foreign codes. Rochefort joined this effort in 1925, fresh from language school, and spent the next 17 years moving between assignments in cryptanalysis, intelligence analysis, and operational planning. He learned Japanese not from textbooks alone, but from living in Tokyo, walking its streets, listening to its rhythms, absorbing the culture that shaped the language. This immersion gave him an intuitive grasp of how Japanese officers thought, how they structured their communications, what phrases they used in formal versus informal contexts. It was an advantage that no purely mathematical approach could replicate. By the time war came, Rochefort had become one of the Navy's foremost experts on Japanese naval communications. He understood JN-25 not as an abstract puzzle, but as a system created by human beings with particular habits, preferences, and limitations. He knew that Japanese radio operators under pressure would sometimes reuse certain phrases or fall into predictable patterns. He knew that administrative messages tended to be less carefully encrypted than operational orders. And he knew that weather reports, supply requests, and routine traffic often contained clues that could be cross-referenced with more sensitive communications. And he knew that the key to breaking any code was volume. The more intercepts you had, the more patterns you could detect, the more associations you could build. This is why he insisted on logging everything, on keeping detailed records of even the most fragmentary decrypts. He was building a database in his mind and on paper. A vast, interconnected web of relationships that would allow him to recognize familiar patterns instantly when they reappeared.
Station Hypo itself was a warren of improvised workspaces carved out of the basement of the administration building. The walls were lined with filing cabinets stuffed with intercept sheets, each one annotated with dates, call signs, and partial translations. Long tables held stacks of worksheets where analysts recorded frequency assignments, traffic volumes, and correlations between different units. A separate room housed the IBM punch card machines, primitive by later standards but revolutionary at the time, which allowed the team to sort and cross-reference thousands of data points mechanically. The machines clattered day and night, processing card after card, producing long printouts that analysts would then study for anomalies. In another corner sat the radio receivers, their dials glowing faintly in the dim light, headphones draped over the backs of chairs where operators had paused to rest. The receivers were tuned to frequencies used by the Japanese Navy, listening constantly for traffic that could be recorded and passed to the cryptanalysts. The men who worked in this space came from remarkably diverse backgrounds. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer was a mathematics instructor at the Naval Academy who had volunteered for intelligence work. Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright had trained as a band leader before the war and possessed an uncanny ability to recognize patterns in sequences of numbers.
Lieutenant John Williams had studied cryptanalysis under the legendary William Friedman, the civilian who had cracked Japanese diplomatic codes in the 1930s. There were also civilians, linguists who had lived in Japan as missionaries or businessmen, mathematics hired on emergency contracts, and a handful of women who handled clerical work but often contributed insights that proved critical. They worked long shifts, 12 to 16 hours at a stretch, with only brief breaks to eat or nap on cots set up in side rooms. The atmosphere was one of intense concentration, punctuated by moments of black humor and quiet camaraderie. They understood that their work was classified, that they could not speak of it to anyone outside the unit, that success would likely go unrecognized while failure would be catastrophic. And they accepted these terms without complaint because they believed in the mission and trusted Rochefort's leadership. Rochefort himself was an enigma to many who worked under him. He was soft-spoken, almost shy, yet commanded absolute authority. He never raised his voice, never berated subordinates for mistakes, never claimed credit for breakthroughs. Instead, he asked questions, probing, specific questions designed to test assumptions and expose gaps in reasoning. If an analyst presented a conclusion, Rochefort would ask what evidence supported it, what alternatives had been considered, what percentage of certainty could be assigned. He forced his team to think rigorously, to distinguish between what they knew and what they assumed. And he led by example, working longer hours than anyone else, reviewing every significant decrypt personally, and making the final judgments on which interpretations to forward to Nimitz. His colleagues noted that he seemed to carry the weight of the entire Pacific Fleet on his shoulders, that he ate little and slept less, that his hands sometimes trembled from exhaustion. But they also noted that he never wavered, never expressed doubt, never allowed the pressure to compromise his judgment. He was, in the truest sense, a professional, someone who understood that his personal comfort was irrelevant compared to the lives that depended on his accuracy. The technical challenge of breaking JN25 cannot be overstated. Modern encryption systems rely on algorithms so complex that even the fastest computers require years to crack them by brute force. JN25 was far simpler by those standards, yet still formidable in 1942. The system worked like this. Japanese naval headquarters would send a message encoded first by looking up each word or phrase in a codebook, which assigned it a 5-digit number. For example, the word battleship might be represented by the number 12345, while depart might be 67890. These numbers would then be written out in sequence to form the plaintext message. But then, to prevent straightforward decryption, the encoder would add a second set of 5-digit numbers, drawn from an additive table that changed periodically. These additives were added to each code group digit by digit without carrying over. So, if the code group for battleship was 12345 and the additive was 54321, the final enciphered group would be 6666. This double-layer encryption meant that even if you captured a message, you faced two separate problems: stripping away the additive to reveal the underlying code groups, and then identifying what each code group represented. The additive tables could sometimes be reconstructed through statistical analysis. If you had enough messages using the same additive table, you could compare them and look for patterns, repeated sequences, common words, structural regularities. This was painstaking work, requiring thousands of messages and months of analysis. But once you recovered the additive, you still faced the harder problem, the code book itself. With tens of thousands of possible code groups, you had to build a dictionary entry by entry, guessing at meanings based on context, then testing those guesses against new messages to see if they made sense. A single misidentified code group could lead to wildly incorrect interpretations. And the Japanese periodically changed both the additive tables and the codebook, forcing the cryptanalysts to start over from scratch. By May 1942, Station Hypo had achieved roughly 40% recovery of JN25, meaning they could read about 4 out of every 10 code groups in a typical message. This was enough to grasp general themes, but not enough to extract precise details. A message might read something like, blank blank fleet, blank blank depart, May 28, blank blank Midway, blank blank. The blanks represented unrecovered code groups. Analysts had to fill in the gaps through educated guesswork, contextual clues, and cross-referencing with other messages. It was like trying to reconstruct a conversation by hearing every third or fourth word. Sometimes the meaning was clear, sometimes ambiguous, and sometimes completely opaque. But Rochefort had trained his team to work with uncertainty, to state their confidence levels explicitly, and to revise their conclusions as new information became available. This intellectual humility, the willingness to admit ignorance and change course, was one of Station Hypo's greatest strengths. As May progressed and Japanese traffic intensified, the codebreakers began to see recurring themes. Multiple messages referenced AF in conjunction with dates in early June. Other messages mentioned carrier divisions, air groups, and large-scale logistics movements. One decrypt referred to a decisive battle that would destroy the American fleet. Another mentioned the need to capture an advanced base for future operations. Individually, these fragments were suggestive but inconclusive. Collectively, they painted a picture of a major offensive aimed at a strategic target in the Central Pacific. The question was, which target? And this was where Rochefort's pattern logging proved decisive. He had been tracking geographic designators for months, noting how certain two-letter codes appeared in contexts associated with specific locations. AK referred to Pearl Harbor. AG was Johnston Island. AI was the Marshall Islands. These identifications had been built up slowly through correlation with known events and cross-referencing with captured documents. Now Rochefort applied the same method to AF. He reviewed every message in which the code appeared, looking for associated terms, time references, logistical details. He noticed that messages about AF often mentioned the need for seaplanes, suggesting an atoll with a lagoon. They mentioned coral reefs, implying a remote island target. They mentioned distance calculations that fit Midway's location relative to Japanese bases in the Marianas. But correlation was not proof. Rochefort needed a way to confirm his hypothesis definitively. And so he proposed the water shortage ruse, a deception so simple that it seemed almost too obvious to work. The idea was to have Midway send an uncoded message, easily intercepted, reporting a mundane problem that would prompt the Japanese to reference AF in their internal communications. If AF really was Midway, Japanese intelligence would report the problem using that code, and Station Hypo would intercept the report. It was a gambit, a test of whether the enemy was listening as carefully as the Americans were. Nimitz approved the plan, understanding that it carried little risk and potentially enormous payoff. On May 19th, Midway transmitted the message, "Freshwater distillation unit broken down. Request immediate supply shipment." The message was sent in plain language over commercial radio frequencies, designed to be overheard.
Then the waiting began. 2 days passed with no result. Rochefort reviewed his logic, wondering if he had miscalculated. Perhaps AF referred to a different target after all. Perhaps the Japanese had not intercepted the message or had dismissed it as irrelevant. But on May 21, a new intercept arrived from a Japanese communications unit. The message was partially encrypted, but Station Hypo had enough of the additive recovered to decrypt a critical sentence. The AF air unit sent out a message that their water distillation plant is out of order. There it was, confirmation clear and unambiguous. AF was Midway. Rochefort had his proof. The ruse became one of the most celebrated intelligence operations of the war, a textbook example of how creative thinking could extract critical information from an adversary. But for Rochefort, it was simply another data point, another fragment added to the pattern. He did not celebrate. He immediately shifted focus to the next set of questions. When? How many ships? What route? What was the enemy's plan of attack? These were operational details that would determine whether Nimitz could position his carriers effectively, or whether they would arrive too late, or in the wrong place, or with insufficient strength. And to answer these questions, Rochefort would need to push his team beyond anything they had attempted before. He would need to extract from fragmentary intercepts a complete picture of Japanese intentions, not just the target, but the timing, the force composition, the tactical approach, the supporting operations. He would need to reconstruct in 72 hours the entire Japanese battle plan. The final push began on May 25. Rochefort gathered his team and laid out the task. They would work around the clock, processing every new intercept the moment it arrived, correlating it against everything they had already decrypted, and building a comprehensive intelligence estimate. Sleep would be optional. Food would be eaten at desks. No one would leave the basement until the job was done. The team understood what was at stake. If they succeeded, the Pacific Fleet would have a fighting chance. If they failed, the fleet would sail blind into an ambush, and the war might be lost. There was no middle ground. The intercepts came in waves, dozens per day, each one logged, time-stamped, and routed to the appropriate analyst. Wright focused on traffic related to carrier movements, tracking call signs and frequency changes that indicated which ships were communicating with each other. Dyer concentrated on administrative messages, which often contained logistical details about fuel allocations, ammunition loads, and personnel transfers. Williams worked on decrypting new additive sequences, trying to push the recovery rate above 50%. Rochefort coordinated everything, moving from desk to desk, asking questions, checking translations, making connections that others had missed. He noticed, for instance, that a message about seaplane tender assignments correlated with another message about scouting patterns, suggesting that the Japanese planned to establish forward reconnaissance posts. He noticed multiple references to Kido Butai, the carrier strike force, appeared in contexts suggesting all 4 frontline carriers would participate. He noticed timing references that clustered around June 4R5, giving Nimitz a narrow window in which to position his carriers.
By May 27, the picture was coming together. Station Hypo had identified the participating carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with their escorts and support vessels. They had identified a diversionary force that would attack the Aleutian Islands on June 3, drawing American attention northward. They had identified the main assault force, which would approach Midway from the northwest and launch airstrikes at dawn on June 4th. They had even identified Yamamoto's position. He would command from the battleship Yamato, positioned several hundred miles behind the carriers, ready to close in once American carriers appeared. It was an intelligence portrait of stunning detail, built from fragments, guesses, and relentless cross-referencing. And it was accurate. Rochefort compiled his findings into a detailed briefing document and presented it to Nimitz on May 27. He spoke quietly, methodically, walking the Admiral through each conclusion and the evidence that supported it. He did not exaggerate. He did not claim certainty where none existed. He assigned confidence levels, high confidence that Midway was the target, moderate confidence on the exact timing, reasonable confidence on force composition. Nimitz listened without interrupting, studying the charts and intercept summaries laid out on the table. When Rochefort finished, Nimitz asked a single question. "How sure are you?" Rochefort replied, "I'd stake my career on it." And Nimitz, who had learned to trust Rochefort's judgment over the preceding months, made his decision. He would commit his carriers, all of them, to a position northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese force as it approached. It was a calculated gamble, but the calculation was based on the best intelligence any commander had ever possessed before a major engagement. The carriers sortied on May 28 and 29.
Enterprise and Hornet departed first, followed by Yorktown, which had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea and was barely seaworthy. Damage control teams were still welding plates to her hull as she steamed out of Pearl Harbor. The three carriers rendezvoused at a position designated Point Luck, a patch of empty ocean 200 miles northeast of Midway. There, they waited, maintaining radio silence, their scout planes searching the horizon for signs of the enemy. Aboard the carriers, pilots slept in their ready rooms, mechanics checked engines and loaded ordnance, and intelligence officers briefed squadron leaders on what to expect, based on Rochefort's estimates. The briefings were remarkably precise. The Japanese would approach from the northwest. They would launch their first strike at dawn, and they would be vulnerable to counterattack while recovering and re-yarding aircraft. The pilots were told to expect 4 carriers, to prioritize targets based on which ships had the most planes on deck, and to press their attacks regardless of losses. It was, in essence, a battle plan written by codebreakers. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese bombers struck Midway at 0630 hours, just as Rochefort had predicted. The atoll's defenses, reinforced in the days prior, put up fierce resistance, but the Japanese attack was overwhelming. Hangars burned, fuel tanks exploded, and the airstrip was cratered. Yet even as Midway burned, American scout planes were fanning out across the sea, searching for the Japanese carriers. At 0534 hours, a PBY Catalina spotted the enemy fleet. The report came in, many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. Minutes later, another report, carrier sighted, bearing 320, distance 180. Aboard Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, klaxons sounded. Pilots raced to their aircraft. Engines roared to life. Dive bombers and torpedo planes were launched in waves, climbing into the dawn sky and turning northwest, toward the enemy. Aboard the carriers, pilots slept in their ready rooms, mechanics checked engines and loaded ordnance, and intelligence officers briefed squadron leaders on what to expect, based on Rochefort's estimates. The briefings were remarkably precise. The Japanese would approach from the northwest, they would launch their first strike at dawn, and they would be vulnerable to counterattack while recovering and rearming aircraft. The pilots were told to expect 4 carriers, to prioritize targets based on which ships had the most planes on deck, and to press their attacks regardless of losses. It was, in essence, a battle plan written by codebreakers. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese bombers struck Midway at 0630 hours, just as Rochefort had predicted. The atoll's defenses, reinforced in the days prior, put up fierce resistance, but the Japanese attack was overwhelming. Hangars burned, fuel tanks exploded, and the airstrip was cratered. Yet even as Midway burned, American scout planes were fanning out across the sea, searching for the Japanese carriers. At 0534 hours, a PBY Catalina spotted the enemy fleet. The report came in, many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. Minutes later, another report, carriers sighted, bearing 320, distance 180. Aboard Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, klaxons sounded. Pilots raced to their aircraft. Engines roared to life. Dive bombers and torpedo planes were launched in waves, climbing into the dawn sky and turning northwest, toward the enemy. What followed was confusion, courage, and catastrophic violence. The first American strike, torpedo bombers from Hornet, found the Japanese carriers but was slaughtered. Of 15 planes in Torpedo Squadron 8, 14 were shot down, their slow, low-altitude approach making them easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water amid burning wreckage as the battle raged overhead. The torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown fared little better, losing most of their planes without scoring a single hit. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. The low-altitude torpedo attacks drew Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the upper air undefended. And at precisely that moment, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead. At 10:22 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadron, spotted the Japanese carriers below. Akagi, Kaga and Soryu were turning into the wind, preparing to launch a second strike. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines were exposed, and ordnance lay stacked on deck, waiting to be loaded. McCluskey did not hesitate. He rolled into a dive, his squadron following, plummeting through 6 miles of sky toward the vulnerable carriers. The dive bombers screamed downward at nearly vertical angles, their engines shrieking, their pilots fighting to hold their targets in the crosshairs. At 2,000 feet, they released their bombs and pulled up, feeling the crushing weight of gravity as their aircraft strained to recover from the dive. Behind them, explosions rippled across the Japanese carriers. Akagi took a bomb on her midship elevator, which detonated ordnance stored below and set off a chain reaction of fires. Kaga was hit by 4 bombs, which ignited fuel and ammunition on her hangar deck. Soryu took 3 bombs amidships, punching through the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft below. Within 5 minutes, all 3 carriers were engulfed in flames, their crews abandoning ship as secondary explosions tore through the hulls. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, escaped the initial attack and launched a counterattack against Yorktown. Japanese bombers scored 3 hits, crippling the American carrier and forcing her crew to abandon ship. But by late afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and subjected her to the same devastating attack. She burned through the night and sank the following morning. In the span of 1 day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, approximately 200 aircraft, and thousands of trained pilots and crew, an irreplaceable loss. Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster, ordered a general withdrawal. The Midway operation was canceled. The decisive battle he had sought had been decisive, but not in the way he intended. The victory at Midway was celebrated across America as a turning point, proof that the Japanese Navy was not invincible, that American forces could win against overwhelming odds. Newspapers ran banner headlines, newsreels showed footage of pilots being decorated, carriers returning to port, jubilant crowds. The public did not know, could not know, that the battle had been won before it began, in a basement in Hawaii, by men whose names would not appear in the history books for decades. Rochefort and his team understood this. They read the reports, saw the casualty lists, and knew that intelligence had tipped the balance. Without their work, Nimitz would have positioned his carriers differently, or not at all. The ambush would have failed. The Japanese would have taken Midway, established a forward base, and continued their advance. The war would have lasted longer, cost more lives, and possibly ended differently. This was the burden of their knowledge. They understood, better than anyone, how close the outcome had been, how much depended on fragments decrypted at the last possible moment, how easily the entire operation could have collapsed.
Yet there was no public recognition. Station Hypo's role remained classified, a secret so closely guarded that even senior officers were not briefed on the details. Rochefort was told to continue his work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. And within weeks, the bureaucratic infighting began. Officers in Washington, jealous of Station Hypo's success and resentful of Rochefort's influence with Nimitz, began circulating critiques of his methods. They claimed that his estimates had been too speculative, that he had bypassed proper channels, that his team's work was unreliable. Admiral King, who had initially doubted the identification of AF as Midway, was reluctant to acknowledge that a subordinate intelligence unit had been correct while his own staff had been wrong. Instead of celebrating Rochefort's achievement, the Navy's bureaucracy moved to marginalize him. In October 1942, Nimitz submitted a recommendation that Rochefort be awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his role in the Midway victory. The citation detailed his leadership, his analytical brilliance, and his decisive contribution to the battle's outcome. But the recommendation was blocked by officials in Washington, who argued that intelligence work did not merit combat decorations. Rochefort was instead reassigned to an administrative position in San Francisco, far from the front lines and the code-breaking work he had devoted his life to. He accepted the reassignment without protest, unwilling to jeopardize the secrecy of Station Hypo's operations by making his case publicly. And so he faded into obscurity, spending the remainder of the war in staff positions that made little use of his talents.
His team continued the work without him. Station Hypo was reorganized and eventually absorbed into a larger intelligence structure. But the methods Rochefort had pioneered, the obsessive logging, the cross-referencing, the willingness to work with partial information, became standard practice. Throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, American codebreakers provided commanders with detailed intelligence on Japanese ship movements, supply convoys, and operational plans. They enabled the submarine campaign that strangled Japan's merchant marine, sinking tankers and transports faster than they could be replaced. They provided targeting information that allowed American forces to ambush Japanese reinforcements and isolate island garrisons. And they contributed to the broader Allied effort to intercept and decode Axis communications, sharing techniques and insights with British codebreakers at Bletchley Park and with cryptanalysts working on German and Italian codes. The importance of signals intelligence in World War II cannot be overstated. It was, in many ways, the hidden war, a conflict waged in the shadows where victories were measured in decrypted messages, and defeats meant that soldiers died because commanders lacked warning. The Allies' success in this hidden war gave them a strategic advantage that persisted throughout the conflict. They could anticipate enemy moves, position forces effectively, and exploit weaknesses that the enemy believed were concealed. The Axis powers, by contrast, consistently underestimated the vulnerability of their communications. Germany's Enigma machines, which Nazi leadership believed unbreakable, were systematically decoded by British and Polish cryptanalysts. Italy's naval codes were compromised early in the war, allowing the Royal Navy to intercept convoys bound for North Africa. And Japan's JN-25, despite periodic updates and modifications, remained partially readable for the duration of the war. This failure to secure their communications was not due to lack of sophistication. The Axis codes were technically complex, but to a failure of imagination. They could not conceive that their enemies would devote the resources, patience, and intellectual effort necessary to break systems that seemed mathematically impenetrable. The coffee cup remained a constant presence in Station Hypo, a symbol that transcended its humble function. It was refilled countless times, passed from hand to hand, used and reused until the ceramic was stained dark and the handle chipped. No one considered it remarkable. It was simply there, part of the landscape of the basement, as familiar as the typewriters in the filing cabinets and the rattling ventilation. But in retrospect, it represented something profound. The idea that endurance, more than brilliance, was the key to victory. Rochefort and his team did not crack JN-25 through a single flash of insight. They cracked it through months of incremental progress, through the accumulation of thousands of small observations, through the willingness to keep working when progress seemed impossible. The coffee kept them awake, kept them focused, kept them going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. It was a prosaic necessity, but necessity is often the foundation of greatness. After the war, as the secrecy surrounding signals intelligence began to lift, journalists and historians started piecing together the story of Midway. They interviewed participants, reviewed declassified documents, and gradually reconstructed the battle's hidden dimension. Rochefort's role emerged slowly, through articles in naval journals, memoirs by former colleagues, and academic studies of the codebreaking effort. By the 1970s, his contribution was widely acknowledged within military and intelligence circles, but he received no official recognition. He had retired in 1953 and lived quietly in California, declining interviews and avoiding publicity. When approached by historians, he redirected credit to his team, insisting that intelligence was a collective effort and that singling out individuals was misleading. This humility was genuine, but it also reflected a deeper truth. Rochefort understood that his work had been part of a larger system, a vast machinery of intelligence collection and analysis that spanned continents and involved thousands of people. Station Hypo had been one node in that system, critical but not singular. And Rochefort himself had been one codebreaker among many, distinguished by leadership and judgment but dependent on the efforts of others. In 1985, more than 40 years after Midway, the Navy finally acknowledged its error. President Ronald Reagan, in a White House ceremony, posthumously awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal and the Legion of Merit. Rochefort's daughter accepted the medals on his behalf. The citation read, in part, "For exceptionally meritorious service as officer in charge of the Combat Intelligence Unit. His courage, leadership, and profound knowledge of the Japanese language and enemy naval operations were instrumental in the defeat of the enemy in the Battle of Midway. His actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." It was a belated recognition, one that came too late for the man it honored, but it served a purpose. It acknowledged that intelligence work, though invisible, is as vital to victory as firepower and logistics. It acknowledged that the heroes of war are not only those who fight on the front lines, but also those who labor in obscurity, decoding the enemy's secrets and giving commanders the information they need to make decisions. The broader lessons of Rochefort's achievement extend beyond World War II. In the decades since, the principles he established have become foundational to modern intelligence practice. The National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and intelligence services around the world all operate on the understanding that information, properly gathered and analyzed, can provide decisive advantages. The technologies have changed. Computers have replaced punch cards, algorithms have replaced manual cross-referencing, satellite imagery has supplemented radio intercepts. But the underlying philosophy remains the same. Trust the process, accumulate the data, and believe that patterns will emerge. Rochefort's obsessive logging, once dismissed as eccentric, is now recognized as a fundamental technique. Every intelligence analyst, in some sense, follows in his footsteps.
Yet there is also a cautionary element to Rochefort's story. His marginalization after Midway illustrates how bureaucracies can fail to recognize excellence, how personal rivalries and institutional jealousies can undermine effectiveness, and how the people who make the greatest contributions are not always the ones who receive credit. This is a persistent problem in intelligence work, where success is often invisible and failure is catastrophic. Analysts who prevent disasters through accurate warnings receive no recognition because the disasters did not occur. Analysts who miss warnings are blamed, even when the information was ambiguous or incomplete. This asymmetry creates perverse incentives, encouraging caution and conformity over boldness and innovation. Rochefort succeeded because he was willing to take risks, to trust his judgment even when others doubted, and to stake his career on conclusions that could not be proven until events unfolded. But that same willingness made him vulnerable to criticism from those who preferred safer, more conventional approaches. The human cost of code breaking is another dimension of the story that deserves recognition. The men and women who worked at Station Hypo sacrificed their health, their personal lives, and in some cases, their futures to the demands of the mission. They developed chronic illnesses from the stress and poor working conditions. They suffered nervous breakdowns from the unrelenting pressure. Some struggled with alcoholism or depression in the years after the war, unable to speak of their experiences and unable to find civilian work that matched the intensity and purpose of what they had done. They were, in a very real sense, casualties of the war, though their wounds were psychological rather than physical. And because their work remained classified for decades, they could not seek recognition or support. They carried their burdens alone, in silence, and many died without ever receiving the acknowledgement they deserved. There is also the question of what might have happened if Station Hypo had failed. If Rochefort had not cracked the AF code, if the water shortage ruse had not worked, if the final 72 hours of analysis had produced ambiguous or incorrect conclusions, the Battle of Midway would have played out very differently. Nimitz might have positioned his carriers too far north or too far south, or kept them in Pearl Harbor waiting for clearer intelligence. The Japanese would have struck Midway without opposition, captured the atoll, and established a forward base that threatened Hawaii itself. American morale, already fragile after 6 months of defeats, might have collapsed. Public pressure for a negotiated peace might have intensified.
The industrial mobilization that eventually produced the vast fleets and armies of 1943 and 1944 might have been slower or less comprehensive. And the war, instead of ending in August 1945 with Japan's unconditional surrender, might have dragged on for years with incalculable additional casualties. This is the counterfactual that haunts historians of Midway: how close the Allies came to disaster and how much depended on the work of a few dozen people in a basement in Hawaii. Rochefort understood this better than anyone. In the rare interviews he gave late in life, he spoke not of triumphs but of responsibility, of the weight of knowing that lives depended on his accuracy, of the sleepless nights spent reviewing intercepts and second-guessing his conclusions. He spoke of the moment when Nimitz asked, "How sure are you?" and the realization that his answer would determine the fate of thousands of men, most of whom he would never meet, whose names he would never know. He spoke of the relief he felt when news of the victory reached Station Hypo, not because it vindicated his work, but because it meant that his calculations had been correct, that the intelligence had been good, that the men who fought and died at Midway had not been sent into battle on the basis of a mistake. This sense of responsibility, this profound awareness of the human consequences of intelligence work, defined Rochefort's character and shaped his legacy. The symbolism of the coffee cup, mundane though it may seem, captures something essential about the American approach to war. Unlike the Axis powers, which emphasized ritual, hierarchy, and the cultivation of warrior mystique, the United States fought with pragmatism, adaptability, and a willingness to employ whatever worked. The coffee cup represented the everyday, the unglamorous, the ordinary made extraordinary through sheer persistence. It was not a sword or a banner or a medal, but it was no less important. It fueled the effort, sustained the will, and became, in its way, an emblem of democratic endurance. The codebreakers who drank from it were not Superman. They were civilians in uniform, ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, doing work that required not heroism in the traditional sense, but discipline, patience, and the refusal to quit. And they succeeded because their society valued those qualities, because democracy, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, can mobilize intelligence and creativity in ways that authoritarian systems cannot. The final hours before the Battle of Midway were spent in quiet anticipation. In the basement of the 14th Naval District, the codebreakers had done everything they could. The intelligence estimate had been delivered, the carriers had been positioned, and now the outcome rested with the pilots, the gunners, the sailors who would fight the battle. Rochefort sat at his desk, listening to the typewriters, smoking another cigarette, and waiting for news. He did not sleep. He could not. The waiting was, in some ways, harder than the work, because there was nothing left to do but hope that the intelligence had been correct, that the assumptions had been sound, that the fragments had been assembled into an accurate picture. And when the first reports came in, carriers sighted, dive bombers attacking, ships burning, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, not for his own sake, but for the knowledge that the work had mattered, that the intelligence had made a difference, that the men who fought at Midway had been given the advantage they needed. The broader war continued for 3 more years after Midway, but the trajectory had shifted. Japan never again mounted a major offensive. Its carrier fleet, the instrument of conquest in 1941 and early 1942, had been shattered and could not be rebuilt. The United States, by contrast, was just beginning to mobilize its full industrial strength. New carriers were launched, new aircraft rolled off assembly lines, new pilots completed training. The island-hopping campaign began, a slow, bloody advance across the Pacific that would eventually bring American forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. Throughout this campaign, intelligence remained a critical factor. Codebreakers tracked Japanese convoy routes, allowing submarines to intercept supply ships. They identified the locations of fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations. They decoded Japanese assessments of American strength, revealing which threats the enemy took seriously and which they dismissed. And they provided strategic warning of Japanese plans, ensuring that American commanders were never again caught by surprise as they had been at Pearl Harbor. The war in Europe followed a similar pattern. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working in parallel with their American counterparts, systematically decrypted German military and diplomatic communications. The intelligence gained from these efforts, codenamed Ultra, allowed Allied commanders to anticipate German troop movements, identify supply lines, and exploit weaknesses in enemy defenses. The invasion of Normandy, the campaign in North Africa, the Battle of the Atlantic, all were shaped by the intelligence advantage that codebreaking provided. And after the war, when historians gained access to classified records, it became clear that signals intelligence had been one of the decisive factors in the Allied victory. Not the only factor, certainly. Industrial production, military strategy, and the courage of millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen all played essential roles, but a factor without which the outcome might have been very different.
Rochefort's legacy, then, is not merely his contribution to the Battle of Midway, significant though that was. It is the demonstration that intelligence, conducted with rigor and integrity, can change the course of history. It is the proof that patience and persistence can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. It is the example of leadership that prioritizes accuracy over credit, that values the team over the individual, that understands that success in a war is measured not by medals and promotions, but by the lives saved and the disasters averted. And it is the reminder that in a democracy, the people who make the greatest contributions are often not the ones who seek glory, but those who do their work quietly, competently, and without expectation of reward. In the final analysis, the story of Station Hypo is a story about trust. Trust in the process, trust in the team, trust in the accumulation of evidence, and trust in the judgment of professionals who had devoted their lives to understanding the enemy. Nimitz trusted Rochefort when he said, "I'd stake my career on it." And that trust extended across the chain of command from a basement in Hawaii to the flag bridge of an aircraft carrier made victory possible. It is a lesson worth remembering, that in moments of uncertainty, when the stakes are highest and the information is incomplete, the willingness to trust expertise can mean the difference between triumph and catastrophe. Rochefort earned that trust through years of study, through months of painstaking work, and through the 72 hours in May 1942 when he and his team pushed themselves to the limit and delivered the intelligence that changed the war. May 27, 1942. A basement in Hawaii, the air thick with smoke and the sound of typewriters. A coffee cup on a desk, stained and chipped, refilled for the 100th time. And a man in a red smoking jacket, hunched over intercept sheets, logging patterns, trusting the process, and changing the course of history. This is the nature of intelligence work, unglamorous, exhausting, often unrewarded. But when it succeeds, it does so absolutely. Rochefort and his team did not fire the shots that sank the Japanese carriers at Midway, but they aimed the gun. And in doing so, they proved that obsession, applied with discipline and purpose, can crack even the most unbreakable code. 72 hours. That was all it took. 72 hours, a basement, and the refusal to give up. That is the story of how one man's obsessive pattern logging turned the tide of the Pacific War. And it is a story worth remembering, not because it glorifies war, but because it honors the quiet, relentless work that makes freedom possible.